Let's move on now to our top story, and there are calls for senior NHS bosses to be regulated in the same way as doctors after management at the trust where Lucy Letby worked ignored warnings from medics.
Now, the lead paediatric consultant who blew the whistle on the killer nurse also said there should be a statutory inquiry into the case. Dr. Stephen Breary had to fight for 2 years to get police to investigate the unexplained deaths in the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, where both he and Letby worked.
Joining us now is Roy Lilley, a former NHS Trust chairman.
And Andrew Pepper-Parsons, Director of Policy and Communications at Protect, a whistleblowing charity which aims to stop harm in the workplace. Thank you so much for joining us both. Andrew, can you tell us a little bit about your charity and why it was set up in the first place?
Yeah, sure. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. And in 1993, we were set up really in the light of sort of Clapham rail disaster and the sinking of the Zeebrugge ferry to give access to legal advice to whistleblowers. So staff who are aware of wrongdoing, risk, malpractice in their place of work. And in those public inquiries into those disasters, they are found to have either raised the concerns to the wrong people or been too afraid to come forward. And so we're really a place to kind of empower and give advice to whistleblowers so those concerns can be raised.
And if I may bring in Roy now. Roy, you and I have spoken many, many times about this, but essentially, and obviously I've worked in this environment, there are clinicians here, senior clinicians, who tried to speak out repeatedly ignored by management. Nothing was done. I was looking actually at the figures in terms of management. They say the official line from the NHS is about 3% are managers in terms of staffing. We think it's much higher. We think it's something like 30%. Clearly, there is a major problem going on in these NHS trusts with the scale and standard of management.
Well, I'm not sure how generalised it is, but certainly as far as the Countess of Chester is concerned, the whole thing was handled very badly by managers who were pretty incompetent, I think. So, and as far as regulating managers is concerned, there was a survey done by the Institute of Health and Social Care Managers before COVID, which asked managers about regulation, and 70% of managers said they welcome regulation. So there's no problem as far as the managers are concerned about regulation. The difficulties being from the government point of view, the actual legal capacity to regulate managers, as the so-called fit and proper person test, goes back to 2014. It's never been properly implemented, and it's only just recently that there's been a review to give it more teeth. In fact, back, I think it was in 2018, the CARC report, which was commissioned by today's Secretary of State for Health, Steve Barclay, he was a minister then, he asked CARC to look into the fit and proper person reporting mechanisms. CARC made some very sensible recommendations which were ignored by government. And the similar thing happened after the Francis report into what happened at mid-staffs. You and I will, I'm sure, remember that, as will a lot of our viewers this evening. And Francis made recommendations about people and the revolving door, how they could be poor managers and again go and move on, go somewhere else. And he wanted to put a stop to that. The government said they would do that, but didn't act. So really, this is not an issue as far as managers are concerned. It's a question of the political will to get on and do it.
Absolutely right. And I said this yesterday. Of course, it was called for by medics in 2013 in the British Medical Journal, as you rightly say, with mid-staffs and the Francis report. They said this is what we need to do. We still haven't done it 10 years later, and it's long overdue. Just to give us a flavour, if you may, about the way that senior doctors work in the NHS. We heard yesterday it's a monopoly. It's very difficult for doctors currently to speak out and say they're very unhappy with the standard of management.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, my view for management is that it's the job of management to create the time and space for good people to do great things. And it's a facilitating role of management. And that was the style I always tried to adopt. But the difficulty is this, and David, you know this as well as I do, the first sign of trouble, managers circle the wagons. They try and keep the lid on it. The last thing they want is a visit from the CQC. The last visit they want is from the regional apparatchiks of NHS England. They don't want the press involved, and God forbid the police get involved. So they try and put the lid on it. And that's, I think, what happened here. And then you get a thing called cognitive bias, where managers really only look at the world through their own perception. So when a doctor comes and says, look, I think we've got a child murderer on the wards, the manager will say, I mean, this is beyond my comprehension. It's most unlikely. There's only ever been 16 of these child murderer cases globally ever. And I don't think it's going to happen at the county suggested. There must be a medical reason or a digital, some kind of aberration in the numbers. That then goes onto something called cognitive bias, which we see with airline pilots, and they get disoriented by information. They stick to one course of information and crash the plane. That's what's happened here. The managers are stuck to a course of action. As the evidence has mounted, they've ignored it, or they've tried to put a different interpretation on it. And finally, you get something called groupthink, which is what happened at the board. The board are told there's a problem. The managers will say, this is the way we've managed it. We don't think it's this, we think it's that. And the board, who are not sufficiently questioning, who aren't properly trained, I mean, very, very few boards have any formal training, they don't ask the right questions. And then they say, okay, fine, well, it's groupthink. We'll go along with what the managers say because it sounds like they're doing the right thing and it's a difficult job. So you get those three things that come together and you get a disaster like this.
And Andrew, can I just bring you back in again? So your charity works not just with people or whistleblowers who are from within the NHS, but from all kinds of industries in the UK. How did people first come to you? What's the first port of call? Do they call up? Do they send an email? Can they speak to you anonymously, or do they need to give their name?
No, they can speak to us anonymously. The typical sort of whistleblowing journey that we see is really most people have raised concerns, and most people raise concerns with their employer. I think the key thing to remember with whistleblowing, whether it's the NHS or finance or a factory, is that people want to believe their employer is going to do something, is going to act on the concerns. Not everybody works in a place where, you know, the managers are corrupt or the organisation is not going to deal with the issues. Most people want to raise concerns. We usually find like 78% of people have tried to raise it somewhere internally. But you need those external mechanisms, really. You need those places, regulators, police, maybe MPs, to kind of break out of
Sorry to interrupt.
kind of.
What are those external mechanisms? That's the point at which you would come in?
Yeah, no. We're an advice service. We're a civil society really at the day, so we give clear, independent advice to whistleblowers. So if the situation means that, you know, a whistleblower has to go to a regulator, so in the health context, be the Care Quality Commission or the police, like really what we're talking about here, which is the failings with the Letby cases, that you know, managers appear to be very slow to kind of approach the police. And one of the options, one of the things that I think might come out in the inquiry and hope is looked at, is that, you know, those external options was part of that discussion in terms of how to blow the whistle to start, how managers respond to whistleblowing concerns, because employers have to be comfortable with that external disclosure. And the way the law works in this country is it protects both disclosures to regulators, but also to the media. So there's kind of always this recognition that there's a safety valve, which is really important.
Right, and bringing you back in, Roy, if I may, we've all said we need an inquiry, it needs to report back very quickly, we need to learn and we need to implement it quickly. Now, the question is, at the moment, it's a non-statutory inquiry. The government, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, is saying, well, look, we might give it more teeth, we might actually compel witnesses to appear. Do you think that's the right way to go?
Yes, I mean, I'm in two minds here, to be honest, David. I mean, I think that there will be no shortage of people who want to come forward and give evidence to this inquiry. Indeed, the chief executive, who was in post at the time, has issued a very long and detailed statement of all the activities and everything he did at the time. The former chairman, who's now retired, is Sir David Nicholson, David Nichols, who I'm sure you will know, was formerly the boss of the whole of the NHS. And the nurse director is working elsewhere, and she's been suspended at the moment. She says she will give evidence as well. So I don't think there would be a problem of people giving evidence, to be honest. But I do understand it from the parents' point of view. They want no stone unturned, and they will feel rightly, I think, that without the force of the law behind this, they will feel that there hasn't been a rigorous enough inspection of events. So I think probably I'm changing my mind, and I'm coming round to the opinion that probably to satisfy the families and public opinion, it would be better if the inquiry had the force of law.
I couldn't agree more, actually. And Andrew, just from your point of view, obviously the new guidelines have been announced by the British Medical Association about the way that doctors can start reporting concerns. You welcome that, I assume?
Yeah, and I would just add to that that I think the key thing that the innovation really the GMC have come up with is to kind of task doctors with senior leadership role to kind of help create that kind of culture where staff can raise concerns. I mean, that's a key point, is to holding senior managers to account. I think the key thing that we see from the NHS, whether it's any kind of sector really, is that we're not in a position where whistleblowers are being listened to by senior leadership really. And it's really trying to design a system where you kind of create that incentives. You can't design a culture. That comes after in time and with training as well. But I think, that's a key point, is to have that kind of guideline. Yeah. So yeah, GMC's guidelines are really welcome in that sense, I think.
Yes, I agree with that. And, it's worth looking at what happens in Sweden and in New Zealand, where they have a no-fault basis for all of these things that go on. They start by saying, tell us what happened and how we can put it right. Then we'll figure out what we've got to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. And if there are things that are of a disciplinary nature we're going to have to deal with, we'll deal with that last. But they put the openness first. What we do here is we put the lid on it first. And in Sweden and in New Zealand, they take the lid off first. And it's worth looking at what they're doing. We've got a lot to learn.
We certainly.
And I would just add that
yes.
Training is really key. I think training managers to kind of handle bad news. That's effectively what whistleblowers are doing. I think in the NHS, it's often a bit, speak up's a great term, but it's quite fluffy sometimes. You're challenging power, and it's really uncomfortable to be in that position. You have to train managers to accept that and realise that it's part of, it's going to make their job easier, really.
Yes, I agree.
Yes. Well, you both agree. Thank you very much indeed to both of you, to Roy Lilley and Andrew Pepper-Parsons.